My helmet hair isn't that bad.
I only see from about the top of your headphones.
Yeah. No, not quite.
All right, you're live.
Hello, my name is Daniel Tarade. I am a graduate student in biochemistry at the University of Toronto, a longtime member of Extinction Rebellion, and a member of Socialist Action. Welcome to another in the series of Socialist Action webcasts, now twice a week, Sunday and Thursday evenings. Tonight's topic is Eco-Socialism or Barbarism. I will speak for about 20 minutes, after which we'll hear from Tina Stevens, who is a member of the OPSEU Indigenous Circle and the London Labour Council, and Yvonne Hanson, who was an NDP candidate in the October 2019 federal election and is a member of Socialist Action in Vancouver. Their comments will be followed by your questions, so if you have any curiosities, just leave them in the chat and they'll be read to us at the end of our presentations by our producer, Kurt Young. If you like the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and let's begin. Humans have always had an impact on their environment. Even in prehistory, it is now thought that the hunting activities of humans were probably responsible for the extinction of animals like the woolly mammoth. It's important to note that humans do not exist separate from our environment. We are, in fact, a part of our environment. But it is also equally clear that since the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s, we have witnessed an acceleration in humankind's impact on the environment. I do not need to waste time listing the many urgent catastrophes that humanity is currently facing, least among which is catastrophic climate change. It is sufficient to merely say that the sixth mass extinction event is well underway. And if we do not rapidly confront this crisis, humanity may well join the list of animals that have gone extinct due to humankind's activities. Unlike previous generations, we currently benefit from an increased awareness of environmental issues. In 2017, a survey conducted by the David Suzuki Foundation found that 86% of Canadians were concerned about climate change to some extent. And this awareness and this fear only continues to increase as we witness in real time both the impact of catastrophic climate change and the simultaneous lack of action from our corporate and political leaders. But there's still much confusion about what is the driving force behind environmental destruction and how we can prevent it. It is our action, it is our goal as socialists to harness the steam, the energy of that vast majority of Canadian society that is overwhelmed, but wants to perform meaningful action about climate change. What I hope to discuss is how capitalism is the root cause of environmental degradation and catastrophe. I want to highlight how different groups engage with this crisis and why only a socialist revolution led by a vanguard party is the only way forward. Either we destroy capitalism or capitalism destroys us. Now, I don't want to waste too much time fleshing out Marxist theory of labor either. I'm just going to keep this to a few bullet points so we're all on the same page. If you're interested in Marxist economics, we have other videos on this topic that you can find on our YouTube channel, including the video that we have coming up on Sunday. Capitalism is the dominant economic system of the past 200 years. No one disputes this. The capitalist class owns, controls, and decides on the uses of Earth's precious resources on the basis of profit. That is why corporations like ExxonMobil spend millions of dollars to prevent a transition to clean energy. That would harm them and prevent them from obtaining profit. For capitalism to continue, markets need to grow, and they need to grow exponentially. They need to grow rapidly. That is why businesses and politicians focus so much on growth. You see it everywhere once you're aware of this. Over time, though, rates of profits fall due to competition. This is a law of capitalism. So to maintain growth and to maintain profits, exploitation has to increase. And this could be environmental exploitation, this could be worker exploitation, or it could be both. Exploitation increases through increased production, which produces more waste. It could be lobbying to overturn regulations, which leads to more pollution. It could be lobbying for wars of conquest to access new resources. It could be outsourcing to countries with fewer regulations, or you can exploit workers directly by cutting pensions, cutting benefits, and not increasing salary commensurate with inflation. Another law of capitalism is that short-term gains are more important than long-term losses. And this is because financiers and banks invest in corporations to get a return on their investment. And the best investments are not those that benefit humanity, but are those with the biggest and quickest return. Corporations are machines designed to make more capital. All of this hurts workers and consumers and jeopardizes life on this planet because it's very seldom that what is profitable is good for workers and the environment. Now, the CEOs and the shareholders, they're not stupid or crazy either. They instead personify capital in their role as they pursue profit. If they didn't do this, they would be replaced with someone who does. In Canada, the capitalist drive for profit harms the environment greatly. Among 17 advanced capitalist countries, Canada ranks third highest in per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that a lot of Canadians don't know, and it makes people uncomfortable when they find out, but 75% of all mining companies in the world are based in Canada. The Toronto Stock Exchange is known worldwide as a mining exchange, where registration and compliance are easy. While the capitalist mining and energy sector profit immensely, the worker and the consumer suffers. But it's also important to note that we do not all suffer equally. It is the super exploited worker in the so-called global south that produces the cheap products that we benefit from. And they're also the places in the world where we ship all of our garbage to. So they also suffer the associated pollution. Pipelines are not built through downtown Toronto. Instead, they're generally built through unceded Indigenous territory. And if these pipelines leak, like they often do, it is not Torontonians that have to suffer from this. It's often the Indigenous communities. It is the Wet'suwet'en land defenders who face down our militarized RCMP. It is the Grassy Narrows First Nation that suffers from mercury poisoning in their water since the 1960s. In 2018, over 150 land and water defenders were killed around the world, most of them Indigenous, and all of them hailing for, again, the so-called global south. But when coastal cities flood and entire regions become uninhabitable due to drought or to wildfire or to heat waves, the crisis will spread even further. It will be all working people in the world who will struggle to pick up the pieces and find shelter, while the billionaires this very day are already building bunkers in the Canadian Rockies and elsewhere to survive the climate Armageddon that they are pushing along, really. This is the consequence of business as usual. So when one recognizes the inextricable link between capitalism and the need for perpetual growth, how does a concerned citizen fight for the continued survival of humanity? Most major political parties and organizations call for reform, that to prevent a climate apocalypse, we simply need to pressure companies, either with legislation or with a change in consumer behavior, to become more eco-friendly. This is the neoliberal idea of green capitalism. This is the strategy pursued by the Green Party in Canada and codified by the Paris Climate Accord. This is what Justin Trudeau and the Liberals engage with when they pass a carbon tax and talk about sustainable, clean growth economy. Without addressing the profit motive inherent to the existence of a capitalist ruling class, environmental degradation will always occur. There are also the democratic socialists, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Naomi Klein, etc., that advocate for stronger reforms than the Liberals would. And often these reforms are packaged under a name like the Green New Deal. And these are sweeping reforms that would involve heavy taxation of corporations and top earners, and heavy investment in public sector, including transit, education, and health. Often involves ceasing to build new carbon infrastructure, ending subsidies for oil and gas, and building up the green energy sector. Socialist Action supports these reforms. Most socialists do. If enacted, they would mean real material gains for the working class who has suffered under decades of neoliberal austerity. But these demands are not enough to prevent environmental destruction because they're reformist. The reformers believe that we socialists seek an unrealistic and unattainable goal of replacing capitalism with a worker state to achieve an egalitarian socialist society. But it is we who accept reality. It is not we, but they who propose to reform a system whose fundamental DNA is based on profit over human need, over human survival if it comes to that. It is they who choose to keep a system of exploitation, torture, war, cruel oppression, and pollution of the earth, and try to work within it to change its DNA. We instead say get rid of the insanity and violence inherent in the current system by reorganizing society under democratic workers' power so that human needs can be truly addressed and met. One other fatal weakness endemic to the neoliberal and democratic socialists is the absence of mass action in their strategy. How exactly do they plan to achieve these reforms in the first place, considering the pushback that all reforms get from the capitalists? No capitalist wants even a slight increase in tax rate. So every single battle, no matter how small, needs a strategy. And while mass actions are generally supported by democratic socialists and even some liberals, they are not promoted as an escalating strategy leading to sharpening confrontation with the ruling class and their state. It takes a mass uprising of people from below to challenge the capitalist system imposed from above. Thankfully, we are now seeing that uprising. Environmental groups around the world are now engaging with this idea that mass mobilization of concerned people is necessary to challenge a toxic system. The group that I want to focus on today is Extinction Rebellion. It's a group that I've participated in directly with. It was founded in the UK initially by a group of academics, but has since expanded to be a true grassroots effort. And they issued a declaration of rebellion in the fall of 2018. Their first demand was that the government tell the truth and declare a climate and ecological emergency. And this is a demand that has been won in several countries, including Canada, as of this past summer. Their second demand, though, is a bigger battle. They demand that governments act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. This seems like an absurd demand. This is now less than 5 years away, and 25 years sooner than what is recommended by the IPCC and endorsed by the Liberals in the last federal election. But Extinction Rebellion's demand is actually based in reality. The IPCC recommends halving CO2 emissions by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. They say this would give humanity a reasonable chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial averages, which is what is thought to be needed to prevent the worst effects of catastrophic climate change. But Extinction Rebellion recognizes that a reasonable chance is not good enough when discussing the survival of the human species. If there's ever a challenge that we should be absolutely sure about our efforts, this is one of those challenges. This recognition by Extinction Rebellion makes them a very important ally in the United Front, in the United Eco-Socialist Front. To forward their demands, Extinction Rebellion aims to mobilize 3.5% of the population in direct but nonviolent action. They swarm intersections, bridges, and highways. They occupy corporate and political offices. They put up art installations. They organize die-ins. They put on colorful music demonstrations. They're very creative, I want to stress that. And recently, they've also helped occupy train yards in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en land defenders, which is one of the best examples of direct action in recent Canadian history. It's one of those examples where the issues of Indigenous self-determination were really brought to the forefront and into popular discourse for several weeks. And it also highlighted that the power held by the working class is in their ability to shut down the means of production. Shutting down infrastructure like freight trains really highlighted to a lot of people that we actually have a say, but we have to exercise it in a united and organized manner. But all of this is to say that while Extinction Rebellion is very creative, they're organized, they're active, they do not demand specific policies during these actions, but they instead put forth their third demand as well, which is that the response to the climate crisis be beyond politics, with the government instituting and following the decisions made by a citizens' assembly. The notion of the people having a direct democratic say in the transition away from fossil fuels is one we agree with, but the general sentiment of beyond politics falls short. You cannot be apolitical about a fundamentally political problem. Extinction Rebellion and Socialist Action both demand system change, not climate change. But Extinction Rebellion shies away from naming the system that needs to be changed and advocating for an alternative system. Aside from this idea of a citizen assembly that would exist entirely within the current toxic system. In trying to build a broad apolitical movement, Extinction Rebellion has not evolved past the default reformist mindset. They just take the reforms further. But I have hope that Extinction Rebellion will continue to grow. They do participate in direct democracy within their groups, and in December 2019, I attended the first open house or town hall meeting of Extinction Rebellion Toronto, where they put forth a fourth demand that was to be voted on, and it was passed by a popular vote of over 75%. Their new demand is justice for all, and it calls for self-determination for all Indigenous people, and it centers their climate activism on the needs of marginalized people. It recognizes that an eco-fascist response, even if it solves climate change, is not one that we want. We want a solution that benefits working people, not punishes them. Socialist Action aims to build a vanguard party that clearly names capitalism as the root cause of environmental destruction and correctly names socialism as the solution. To forward this goal, we work within the NDP as the only Labour Party in Canada as members of the NDP Socialist Caucus. This is not because we have any pretensions of the NDP being anti-capitalist. They are in fact staunchly reformist and pro-capitalism. But it is because within the NDP that you'll find the most class-conscious workers, and any mass movement cannot neglect that vital contribution. Socialist Action also works in the labor movement, organizing and running slates of radical candidates on the platform of escalating action to win major victories, such as building up to a general strike to force an early election in Ontario to dump Doug Ford. We participate in a united front to win reforms that will benefit the working class. You cannot expect workers to support your cause if you do not fight alongside them on the picket line or in the streets. But we always view our current struggles in the bigger picture of a socialist revolution. And with that, I would like to list some of our party's transitional eco-socialist demands. We demand a divestment in the fossil fuel sector, stop subsidies for the development of projects based on fossil energy and its combustion, oppose public-private partnerships that currently dominate the energy sector worldwide, mobilize against all extractivist projects, especially new oil exploitation such as shale gas, and large-scale investments at the service of the fossil industry, such as pipelines, refineries, airports, and motorways. Stop nuclear energy, end the exploitation of coal, tar sands, and lignite. We demand and call for support of popular educational programs concerning ecological sustainability. We refuse any capitalist appropriation of lands, of oceans, and of their resources. We call for a defending of women's rights, beginning with the fight against all attempts to criminalize women's decisions concerning their reproductive capacities, free abortion and contraception on demand, paid for by the Social Security healthcare system, defeminize and deprivatize caring for the young, the sick, and the elderly. These are communal responsibilities. We demand recognition of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, recognize their knowledge and their sustainable management of their ecosystems. We demand that refugees be given status. We demand giving refugee status to the victims of ecological and climate disasters, full respect for the democratic rights of refugees, including freedom of movement and settlement. We support the struggles of all oppressed nations and peoples from imperialist exploitation. We fight for the ensurement of good social security systems with guarantees for all individuals, including adequate pensions. We call for the abolishment of multilateral and bilateral free trade agreements. We call for a tax on international air and maritime transport, and the product of this tax should go directly to the countries of the South as a partial compensation of the ecological debt they've incurred. We call for an abolishment of the patent system, and in particular, we call for stopping all patents on life and on technologies concerning energy conversion and storage, end the theft of ancestral knowledge of Indigenous people, notably by pharmaceutical companies. We call for an organization of public research, end the system that submits research to industry. We promote food sovereignty and the protection of biodiversity by agrarian reforms, put in place an ecological, local agriculture without GMOs nor pesticides, and recognize that as a public good. Abolish industrial animal breeding, greatly reduce production and consumption of meat, respect animal welfare. We call for a banning of advertisement and institution of recycle, reuse, and reduce, and consumerist, wasteful, and energy-demanding model imposed by capital. Establish free energy and water as basic necessities, and above this threshold, impose strong progressive tariffs tied to usage in order to fight against waste while ensuring basic access. Guaranteed to workers whose companies are to be closed within the framework of the transition, the right to propose alternative production needed to build a sustainable infrastructure. If those plans are unrealistic, workers maintain social rights to retraining, new work, or retirement. Reduce working time without wage loss, with lower work rates. Implement proportional hiring, especially for youth, women, and minorities. Together with the development of the public sector, this is the best way to reconcile the reduction of the production of goods, of energy consumption, full employment, and democratic transition. Guarantee workers' rights to organize and exert control in the workplace, in particular on occupational health, product sustainability, production efficiency, and we also call for protection of whistleblowers. Now, these are not all of the transitional demands. Those can be found online at socialistactioncanada.ca. And this program, even what you find online, is not meant to be exhaustive. It is and will continue to be enriched by concrete struggles. In an eco-socialist perspective, this enrichment must be guided by the main keys of a just transition: environmental and social justice, common but differentiated responsibilities, a fight against inequality and for an improvement of living conditions, the end to green colonialism and environmental racism, a priority for collective solutions, internationalism, and above all, a principle of precaution. The exploited and the oppressed must develop their empowerment by democracy, decentralization, control, and the collective appropriation or reappropriation of the commons, and a commons that's to be defined by the social processes of its democratic construction, not by nature, which would make certain things as commons while other things would be doomed to private appropriation. That brings me to the end of my statements. At this point, I would like to ask Tina to give her remarks, and then we'll hear from Yvonne later, and then we'll go to questions at the end. Tina?
Ani and Bojo, Miigwech Daniel, for all of those words. Very educational and taken to heart with respect to the current situation, even that we're on now. I think for myself, in regards to when we look at the impacts of any type of neoliberalism, or in terms of any type of impacts in regards to decisions that are made by both the federal government, the provincial governments, as well as their local governments, they still continue to push that line, push that boundary in regards to making sure, that their provisions of greed take over with respect to the rights of many people and the human rights of many people across this land, across Canada. And so I'm Tina Stevens. I am secretary for the OPSEU's Indigenous Circle, and I've been down there for a number of years, where we do have to confront the governments, and we've raised a lot of different awareness and issues, even within our own union of OPSEU, to educate our members in regards to not only the severities of impacts that have existed as a result of colonialism over, not only just decades of times, but hundreds of years. And so we do educate ourselves, and that's the only way that, is one of the solutions that we find is working in regards to being able to speak out for ourselves, because the fact that nobody's coming to us as Indigenous peoples to ask for opinions. And so they are now, times are changing, but in regards to being able to look at, being able to start raising the tensions, start raising the terms, start raising in regards to the awareness, in regards to what's happening to Mother Earth, in regards to how the impacts of future generations are on our hands. It's our responsibilities as Indigenous women to be stewards of the land. And so there's a lot of education through our Indigenous courses that we teach our own members. And as well, as part of being part of London and District Labour Council as their secretary, I observe, I look at in terms of the degradations of women sometimes, and degradation of Indigenous women specifically in our communities. And so when I look and point to the way that people are treating Mother Earth, they have a direct connection in regards to the way that the women in our communities are being abused, and continually are having to stay with their abusers, and having to be a part of a larger and increasing group of human trafficking. So there's a lot of different ways that our people and our communities are being impacted. The other ways, obviously, in regards to, we are the protectors of the water, land protectors as well. And we have to seriously look at, in regards to making assessments of what's the companies that are coming onto our lands and poisoning the waters, or being able to take precious materials and resources and then not being able to replace them once they have finished their business. And so, our common thoughts in regards to our teachings is always that, if you remove something, you place tobacco down and you give thanks for being able to have the use of those resources and to be able to, give back once you've used the land and the water in the right way, and having good thoughts of being able to use it. And obviously, with our counterparts in non-Indigenous worlds, specifically capitalist companies and industries, mining industries, people that have industries that are involved in fracking, people that are doing the man camps in regards to close to the mining companies, wherever the resources are being extracted. So I enlighten that in regards to the taking of the blood of Mother Earth, and that, they do not replace it with anything good. They actually poison it even more. And so, there are serious signs of things that are to come in regards to the way that we are having the ability to be able to speak out now using our voices, Indigenous people. And so, you look at the focuses now in regards to the protests that started way back 25 years ago with OCA. And you look at the protests now that are similar in nature in terms of the blocking of the rails and being able to putting up the blockades in regards to the communities of West Wetton and people that, are trying to hold back and be respectful of the land. But ultimately, when you look at the gaps in regards to the economies, in regards to the way that the capitalists have, made Indigenous people, in a sense, dependent on the monies that they're receiving, that don't go a heck of a long way to be able to support their communities. And when they can't support their communities because of the fact that of all the impacts that are surrounding them and that keep getting closer to them, those monies then are looked upon, that people have the thinking in the myth that, we're not using the monies in the right way to be able to keep our housing conditions, to be able to keep up the conditions of the water, to be able to, look at the different resources, things of being able to look at the entrepreneurs of, being able to establish businesses. And so when you starting to come in close in regards to, and keeps getting smaller and smaller because all of those industries are surrounding you, and you have no say of them surrounding you, it pretty much makes a huge statement of in regards to where the greed and supposed people's rights lies in this particular land. And obviously going back, a number of decades, that has been the result of the implementation of the Indian Act and creation of the Indian Act, and the restrictions that Indigenous peoples had in regards to being able to even take care of their lands in the right way to be able to grow the foods that were needed for the community. Because the fact that, they were put onto reserve lands that were not a good place for being able to grow those resources and to be able to do their fishing and to be able to have the proper hunting grounds and everything else like that. And then, so, we are left with right now, strong prayers and strong dances with respect to being able to tell Mother Earth that we're still standing strong and we're still fighting against the capitalism and the colonialism that everybody has come to know so well across this whole nation. And so, I look at the importance in regards to even the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so, those 7 teachings of the 7 grandfathers of looking at, are we being truly honest with ourselves, in regards to, could we be prepared to live without certain resources in our lives? Or is that just lip service? Again, in regards to when we, make a decision that might have an impact on future generations, we have to be humble and that we have to show our humility that, we are going to have an impact on, 7 generations from now, and hoping that, what we have been able to have and that we rely upon and that we have at our fingertips, living simply and honestly. And so in regards to, I'm hoping that those things are still going to exist in the future. And that's the biggest question when it comes to, around the movement around the eco-socialism, is that, we're working hard to fight against all of these detriments, so that, the way that the intended way that we need to live on this earth, to be able to support one another and to be able to support the survival of each other, going through into the future, is obviously the number one thing that is a priority. And again, the respect for each other, so that we can go hand in hand, and in regards to making sure that we are fighting for these resources to stay in the ground in the right way, and to be able to live a healthy life without getting poisoned by mercury, without being poisoned by toxins that are being released into the waters, in terms of not looking in regards to the amount of GMOs that are being added to our foods. There is so many, a number of different things that we can fight. But Indigenous people, in a sense, I'm not going to say that we're poor at the heart, but there is that huge wage gap. And, it's very difficult for us to fight against the government in certain ways, because of the fact that we are held to huge amounts of poverty within each of our communities. And it's very difficult to be able to stand up for yourself when you're relying, in a sense, on monies to be able to support yourself, and you don't have time to be able to do that speaking out. But our younger generations are being able to do that. I'm so inspired in regards to the younger generations taking their voices to the street, to be able to do the protests, to be able to do the demonstrations, to be able to do the blockades. And I understand there's a lot of hurt feelings that happen and have happened as a result of the stopping of the trains, or in regards to when there's the stopping of a highway, because of the fact that we're trying to speak out and trying to make sure that our voices and the focus is on our needs, the focus is on the issues, that we're still trying to protect the land, that we're still trying to protect Mother Earth, that we're still trying to make sure, again, being very repetitive right now, of that land, resources, and water for our future generations. And right now, we're not going down the right path. People are not living the right road. And so when we look back again with our seven grandfather teachings, I look at the respect that we once had for our elders. I look at the respect for what they did with the land. They knew with respect to what was very important medicines that could heal a number of different people. They were able to be put, in regards to good use for whether it was sunburns. It was good in terms of whether somebody had asthma. It was good in regards to when somebody had the flu, in terms of when they had internal problems. The medicines were there, and they were very healthy, and there was a lot of them in the ground that you could, lay your tobacco down to be able to take. And we knew that they would be replaced because of the fact that we knew how to thank Mother Earth for being able to grow those. And now what we're faced with is, trying to establish that courage that's been taken away through the residential school system and the 60 scoop, of trying to find our way to stand up again for ourselves. Because the fact that we've been battered down and bantered down so much, that we need to find a new way of living. And I know that resurgence within our communities is happening. It may be happening at a snail's pace in some places, but in regards to, we are becoming healthier. And that is the empowerment, that's the engagement in regards to people who want to, make us well again, in a sense, and our allies coming to, with respect to working with us. Being able to reach out, start building those bridges instead of burning them down. And so, unfortunately, with our current environment, with the COVID-19, again, unfortunately, we've had to stop building those bridges, in a sense, with the many closures right across our various nations, because of the fact that we aren't allowed to have outsiders onto the communities. And I know that in a lot of those communities, I know there is a lot of hurt because of the fact that, we're losing, like many of yous out there, in regards to our jobs, in regards to being able to deal with our own self-businesses, and being able to, again, establish that self-determination within each of our communities. We look around each corner to find out what is going to be coming at us next from the governments that's going to absolutely have an impact on our lives. and it never stops. And so that's one thing that, you know, I put out there as a challenge for people, is that in regards to, instead of looking at, in regards to the way that we may look or the way that we love, you know, just sit down and talk with us on one-on-one basis. You know, be able to present yourself and be able to go to meetings and be able to be invited to meetings, to listen to, in terms of the traditional teachings even, that about the way that we're supposed to be caring for Mother Earth and the way that we're trying to stop in regards to the further raping of Mother Earth by the way that the industries treat her. And as well in regards to, when I look at a number of different issues, you know, there is that mass extinction. You talk about mass extinction. Well, there was a mass extinction due to genocide in regards to the Indigenous peoples all across this Canada. And so, you know, despite I'm not a person who blames people. I really, truly don't. But, you know, when you introduce a new system into our lives and on our lands, and we weren't expecting it, and it killed off a number of our Indigenous peoples, it really, you know, did a doozy for us in regards to trying to replenish, trying to, you know, bring our communities back together. And then, you know, in regards to, we had the interaction with the settlers, and, you know, had that shock of climate change in regards to the way that they lived their lives and the way that we lived our lives, and the establishments of the treaties. And we're supposed to be, you know, working together in a right way of being able to be respectful of each other's lives and how they run them. You know, again, environmental racism. You talk about environmental racism now being, you know, put into the highlight. Well, we've experienced for hundreds of years due to the restrictions under the Indian Act and not being able to properly grow our own foods without the approval from the Indian agent or the government that was in place at that particular time, right? So the impact on our species, with the elimination of different, species of plants and animals, in regards to the increase in regards to the pollution and the polluting of our waters and the polluting of our airs. You know, in regards to the loss of trees, when you're talking about climate change, the thing that has the impact the most is the clear cutting of the trees. You know, in regards to are there to protect Mother Earth by providing the proper shade so that Mother Earth can make sure that it remains as cool as it's supposed to be. And instead of that, you know, we're taking away the trees, and that's therefore then heating up the lands as about, along with obviously the treatment by the different polluters, as well as the different occupations that poison the lands and resources. You know, the taking of our water resources, like the companies like Nestle. Sorry, did I hear something?
Sorry. We have to hear from our next guest, Yvonne, as well.
I
so sorry to interrupt.
No, I just had 2 more sentences to say. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, you know, in regards to, when I look at what we're doing now, at this point, you know, there is an urgency to get at the root of that climate change and making those changes. We have to find those radical solutions to change, to combat the settler colonialism that has displaced and killed Indigenous people who are taking care of the lands. And so if we don't choose that now, you know, we have to choose eco-socialism and choose to struggle towards another world, you know, where our relationship with the environment is based on sustainable coexistence, where Indigenous peoples have full control over their land and their destinies through self-determination. And the way that we're going to achieve that is making sure that we pass the legislation for UNDRIP. That is a part of the solution as well for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So those are my comments, and I appreciate being invited to come and speak this evening.
Thank you so much, Tina. You really can't talk about environmental issues without discussing settler colonialism, without discussing environmental racism. So your perspective on that is very appreciated. Thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to your comments during the question period. And now I'll turn it over to Yvonne. Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So today I kind of wanted to talk about costs associated and how we hear the word, like, how do you pay for it? Those questions a lot when we're talking about eco-socialism, socialism in general, environmentalism in general. And I also want to kind of talk a little bit about the current COVID situation, because there are environmentalist kind of impacts and repercussions there that I think are really interesting to examine. So without further ado, so as socialists, we do hear, how do you pay for it? And the cost is too high. We hear that a lot. And as environmentalists, we hear the same thing. We hear the same thing wearing both hats, because these systems are fundamentally interconnected. Environmentalism combats exploitation of the planet, socialism combats exploitation of the people, and eco-socialism combats exploitation throughout the entire system. It's fundamentally premised in equality, circularity, and sustainability. And people argue, and I am certainly inclined to agree, that you can't have socialism without environmentalism, and vice versa. The reason for that is that in order to maximize profit, it is in your best interests to cut both labor costs and resource costs, which results in exploitation of laborers and of resources in various ways that we see under capitalism quite often. If you remove one side of that equation and say, you can no longer exploit X resource, you can no longer get this resource for dirt cheap, it will now be very expensive to extract, then that's going to unbalance the equation, and you're gonna have to make up for that somehow. And the way that that's made up for is by cutting labor costs, thus increasing exploitation of the workforce. So we can't have a system that allows some exploitation as a treat. We need to remove that option completely, which is why socialism and environmentalism really must go hand in hand. So going back to costs, when we examine all of the steep costs associated with environmental action, we see that it's not actually the system itself that would cost all that much. Like if we could just snap our fingers and have a completely perfectly environmentalist system, it would not be that expensive. Our economy also is incredibly productive, and a socialist system would distribute the wealth of that productivity evenly. So for the vast majority of people, it would pull much less money out of their pocket than the current system. An environmentally friendly economy would also cost much less to the average person, simply saving in everyday costs like transit, electricity, and obviously gasoline. It would operate on a circular model, which would require far fewer inputs. An environmentally friendly socialist society would fundamentally be premised on efficiency and sustainability, and would arguably be one of the least expensive conceivable economic models in the long run, because it won't be leaking hundreds of billions of dollars per year into the pockets of the top 0.1%. So when people ask, how are you going to pay for it? They're not actually talking about the system itself. They're talking about the transition to this system. And yeah, that will be really expensive. Rebuilding every building in Canada, retraining 300,000 people who work in the fossil fuel industry, expanding transit, making it free, completely renovating Canada's energy infrastructure, that all just scratches the surface. Not to mention the distinctly socialist aspects we will need to include, like constructing thousands of units of low-carbon social housing, nationalizing critical industries and infrastructure, expanding EI to accommodate people who lost their jobs as a result of this transition. And as socialists, we're not going to lie to you. It will cost big bucks.
Sorry, Daniel. Due to technical issues, you're in control of the camera, and everybody's been just watching you exclusively. Can you press 2 on your keyboard so you can switch the camera over to Yvonne? Thank you.
Let me know when it's good to go.
No, that's the wrong one. All right. Right, Yvonne, continue.
Good to go? Okay, sorry guys. So we as socialists, we're not going to lie to you. This would cost big bucks. It would be really expensive. But those expenditures are overhead costs, not operating costs. The system will pay for itself in the long run, and we will see returns from those investments in our society. It is way cheaper to build everyone a sustainable place to live than it is to police homelessness. It's way cheaper to pay unemployment benefits to fossil fuel workers than it is to foot the bill for climate catastrophes brought on by the fossil fuel industry. And it is way cheaper to help clean energy startups get established and get productive than it is to pay billions and billions in subsidies and tax breaks that prop up big oil. The government, by the way, and this is just an aside, the government only makes back about 3% of profits from the fossil fuel industry. And it gives out around $3.3 billion in direct subsidies, and some estimates put it as high as $30 billion a year in indirect subsidies. So basically paying for the cost of their endeavors. So the idea that Canada really relies on this industry is a myth. Canadian workers rely on this industry as their source of income, and that is something that an eco-socialist government could change. So anyway, once these overhead costs are paid, the operating costs of an eco-socialist system will be way lower than the current system, which essentially writes a blank check for job creating, and I put that in like the heaviest quotes I possibly can, industries to pad their executives' pockets, and then writes another blank check to subsidize all of their employees who can't make enough to live on their pittance of a salary. Essentially, capitalism is free to install, but very expensive to run. And eco-socialism is very expensive to install, but comparatively extremely cheap to run. Okay, so we've established that. Enter COVID-19. The capitalist system right now is completely failing. It's an utter disaster. It's borderline apocalyptic for the capitalist class. Everyone and every industry needs help from the government. We have people calling for extremely explicitly socialist policies like guaranteed basic income. We have governments answering with programs like the CERB. We literally have Republicans in the states calling for the guaranteed basic income like they invented it. And that is wild, having Republicans proposing a guaranteed basic income, just to show you how topsy-turvy things are. The stock market is tanking, oil hit $20 a barrel. It's 1918 and 1929 and 2008 all over again, but all at once and weirder. And suddenly nobody cares about how to pay for it. This question that we are constantly getting asked as socialists, you cannot have a political conversation without somebody asking you, how do you pay for it? Nobody's asking that anymore because it's a necessity. Your asshole conservative uncle who agonizes over every dollar collected by welfare recipients is now shouting at Trudeau on Twitter because the CERB is only 1/3 of what he would be making otherwise. And the USA has gone from hand-wringing over healthcare costs to pulling $1.8 trillion out of nowhere to feed the stock market in a matter of days. Canada's government was fighting tooth and nail against Indigenous land defenders over a few $1 million in lost revenue from the fossil fuel industry this February, and is now pulling $82 billion in stimulus package right out of its ass. Almost like, in an emergency situation, financial costs don't really matter when it comes to saving human lives. Funny how that happens. But the really important part of all of this is that now we are suddenly in a situation where it's going to be way more expensive to save the existing economic system than it would be to install a new one. The capitalist class, which has spent the last 2 decades more lecturing working class people for not being able to save up 3 months of emergency funds after paying 50% of their income in rent, is now lining up outside Parliament asking for hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts from the public coffers to keep their destructive, exploitative industries afloat. It is going to cost billions and billions and billions of dollars to prop up oil and gas through this COVID epidemic. The airline industry, the cruise industry, the stock market, all the corporate bigwigs who suddenly have to pay sick leave, and none of these bailouts, none of them are going to give us a return on our investments beyond underpaid employment opportunities. It is going to be way more expensive to bail out the capitalist class and capitalism in general than to foot the bill for the remaining overhead costs associated with eco-socialism, which will actually give us returns on our investments that I've described. And I say remaining overhead costs because we are already part of the way there. We've paid a lot of the overhead costs to deal with this pandemic already, and we're paying the lion's share of the operating costs right now as well. Transit is free. Rent is subsidized. People who have lost their jobs are receiving a reasonable living wage from the government. People who can are allowed to work from home. The oil industry is completely going under. The worst emitting industries are completely drowning in their own operating costs. Emergency modular housing is being constructed for the homeless. And all of this has happened in less than a month. Imagine, if we had planned this, if this had been intentional, if we had had years to plan this, which we have. Imagine everything is exactly as it is now, except thousands of people aren't dying. Hospitals are running business as usual. There's no virus. Restaurants and retail stores are still open. Friends and parties are still a socially acceptable thing. And no one in the service industry got laid off. And people are being employed in construction. Transit is more accessible and less dangerous. You get upgrades to your house and your telephone bill are $20 a month. We are so close to having this. We are so close. We're closer now than we have ever been. And I really hope that as eco-socialists and as Canadians, we can seize this golden opportunity and make the best of this terrifying and tragic time in history. And if we can't seize this moment now, let's hold this as an example, because this is a dry run for what the eco-socialist revolution could look like, minus all of the negative impacts of the virus. It's not so bad. It's not a war zone. People aren't killing themselves and each other left, right, and center like the right-wingers have predicted they would if we had this kind of economic collapse. Yes, it is new and it is uncertain. It's expensive and it's strange, but we are pulling together and we are getting through this as a community. And that's what humans do best, literally. If we can do this for a virus, we can do this for the planet. When conservatives argue that environmental sensibility will bring the economy grinding to a halt, we can point to this moment in history and say, sure, and that won't be so bad if we handle it appropriately, collaboratively, and build something new together. Thank you. And if we want to move on to questions or something now, not sure.
Yes, we do. We have several questions. Unfortunately, we have some technical issues with our camera control. So I would ask all our participants to first just hit the hang up button and get back into the chat immediately. And once you do that, I should have regained control of the camera and we can continue this as it's supposed to be. Okay. Sorry for all of this, these issues to our guests. We'll be back up shortly.
Did we do it?
Yes.
That was great, Yvonne. That was very inspiring.
Thanks. I had a lot to say about this, clearly. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about because
of course.
There's they're throwing around billions of dollars. Just like that. And we've been hand-wringing over billions of dollars for like 30 years.
Go figure.
Go figure. It's almost like an emergency when it's immediate is actually treated like an emergency.
Go figure. This is awesome. Okay, Kurt?
All right, so yes, we do have some questions, and I'll start from the top, and that we'll start with Catherine Richard asks, I'm wondering what potential there is for Socialist Action Canada to help explicitly focus the energy of more mainstream movements such as Extinction Rebellion. Is there a hope for this at all? And then Jeremiah Mary Karag asks, how can Canada be held accountable for environmental and human rights violations as a result of its global operations of natural resource extraction? And Basil Fowle asks, can you elaborate on animal welfare and socialism for both domestic and wildlife consumption and animal confinement, abuse, etc.?
Okay. Are those the three questions right now?
Those are the three present questions.
Okay, so as I promised all of the people joining me today, I'm not going to try and belabor any of these points. I appreciate all the comments. So Yvonne and Tina, start thinking as I attempt to, off the top of my head, address these points. Okay, so the first question is from Catherine. Do you mind if I call you Kat? What is the potential for Socialist Action Canada to help other mainstream groups, or maybe I shouldn't say other mainstream groups, help mainstream groups like Extinction Rebellion, other environmental groups? I think that is one of the roles we see for Socialist Action Canada as we grow larger. We are trying to collect as many people with as much consciousness as possible to help in a united front. And that means to be able to help direct energy if needed. Now, I think Extinction Rebellion itself is already growing up on its own accord. I do have a lot of hope there. Extinction Rebellion, as I mentioned, started off founded by academics, and academics are fairly conservative on the whole and for the most part. And even though they're caring about the environmental issues, I can see where the apolitical goal came from. They don't want to alienate people with labels. They just care about the science. But it's not an issue of only science here. It's an issue of science. It's an issue of politics. It's really an economic situation that's brought us to this point. It's not like we're being bombarded by asteroids from nowhere and we need a scientific solution for this. It's extraction that's happening because of humans, and humans are extracting based on a certain economic system. So as the movement grows, there are discussions happening within the group to hopefully bring these other issues to the forefront. So the fact that Extinction Rebellion Toronto, on their own accord, passed a demanding Indigenous self-determination is a step in the right direction. The class consciousness is still not there within the group, but maybe it'll come. But that is why socialist groups like Socialist Action will be at those environmental marches, at those environmental rallies and protests with our banners, with our slogans, and we're going to try and help unify that united front and focus that energy where it needs to be. So that is definitely something we need to do, because we're a smaller group, but we punch above our weight and we can help with that. Now, there's a question about how Canada can be held responsible for its corporate activities around the globe in terms of these, let's say, mining corporations and things like that. There's a few ways I can interpret that question just based on responsible. If the question is like, how can Canadians be held responsible? I'm not holding any like Canadian citizen responsible for the actions of the corporations. But once you recognize what's happening, perhaps you have a responsibility or duty to aid in achieving justice. In terms of how can Canada be held responsible in terms of stopping the Canadian corporations from doing what they're doing and bringing them to justice, that's a socialist revolution. Because right now, all they're doing is entirely par for the course within capitalism. You may think it's ugly and disgusting, but most of capitalism is ugly and disgusting because it puts profit ahead of human needs. So yeah, there's actually something I borrowed from Extinction Rebellion. They have a policy of no shame, no blame. They don't blame individuals. Because, and this was something Tina mentioned as well, we all exist in a toxic society. I don't blame a person who drives a car with poor gas mileage if they're a poor worker and that's all they can afford. They need something. That's why, as Yvonne was mentioning, we need to plan our societies in a way where people can live ethically. That needs to be done. Right now, living ethically is basically impossible. There's no ethical consumption in capitalism. And then there's a question from Basil about animal welfare. I think you can look at animal welfare from a few different points of view. If you look at just ethically, we definitely need to have sweeping reforms regarding everything from pets at home to industrial, agricultural, etc. If you're looking at it solely environmentally, then you can get away with still allowing animal exploitation in terms of suffering, but you can just reform the industries that lead to a lot of emissions and pollutions, like the dairy and beef industries are particularly bad examples of industrial agriculture. Well, they're good examples of industrial agriculture that does bad things for the environment. I generally come at it from the perspective that we do need animal welfare as well. We can debate about ethics, but a lot of animals are sentient. They can feel pain. And I think especially as socialists, we should be cognizant of that. We care about human suffering because suffering sucks. And we should care about animal suffering because that also sucks. We can have a prioritization on humans, okay, but we should also always be conscious of what animals are feeling as well, independent of the environmental impact of animal rearing has. And I'll leave it there. Tina or Yvonne, whichever one feels like they're best prepared right now to jump in.
I'll just say some short words. When we look at in regards to being able to, link into the strengths of other organizations, specifically to make sure that organizations such as Extinction Rebellion does and has the ability to carry out in regards to the mandates, carrying out the actions, carrying out in regards to being able to address many issues, that impact a number of different sectors all across Canada. It's something like that, that when they have the strength, when they have the voice, when they have the urgency, that's the type of organization you want to be able to, promote and to be able to contribute to be able to, again, build those bridges from a number of different networking organizations to be able to address a multiple multitude of issues that people have faced, to be able to, again, continue to bring that awareness, to be able to allow people to find those strengths, to be able to rise up when it's needed, when people are called upon, to be able to make sure that, we're all trying to make sure that this land is being protected in ways, in different perspectives. And there's different ways of coming to the same ends from different organizations. So, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, or if you look at, other groups like Council of Canadians, with respect to when you look at the land defenders, when you look at the water protectors, we all are shooting for the same results. We may have a different focus, but we do all need to be able to support one another in the times coming. In regards to being able to hold Canada accountable, you just have to flick on Facebook every single day in regards to the demerits in terms of looking at the fines, looking at in regards to the impacts that Canadian companies are having an impact in international companies. And, that Canada is probably one of the very highest amount that get sued over those companies that are extracting things and then just leaving them for waste in those international lands. And so, there's monies that are coming from Canadians to pay for those penalties. And, that's one way of being able to stand up. But, again, going to the United Nations and being able to stand up and to make it aware that, Canada's dirty secrets, in a sense, to be able to travel to the United Nations and to address these issues for what they are, and to be able to argue that every single right of any Canadian and any single right of Indigenous peoples have to be upheld in a lot of the different jurisdictions. Now, I know in regards to absolutely, when I look at respect for our animal species, when we have to be able to treat them well, just like our fellow human beings, it's a priority to be able to take care of one another, just as Indigenous people do for a community. A community takes care of their people. And the Indigenous people, again, along with other groups, are taking care of the communities currently, even through this particular environment that we're sitting in. But I understand in regards to, there are the extremes in regards to that. The Indigenous peoples have been able to live off the lands, including, the use of being able to extract from our animal friends, because they know the places in our system, ecological system. But in regards to where there's greed and capitalism, other people that are non-Indigenous take a lot, and they take it a lot for greed, and that's where, we eliminate and we, eliminate those species, and that their very existence, is become extinct over over the long period of time that people have been taking advantage of the animal species. And so their welfare is definitely important, but there is a place as well that they fit into the ecological system for meeting the needs of different Indigenous peoples and communities internationally and within Canada.
Awesome, Tina. Yvonne?
Yes, I just have a few quick comments because most of the answers that I wrote down are illegible. So for the question about how Socialist Action can help, or how Socialist Action can help other mainstream groups like Extinction Rebellion, I think one of the main things there would be kind of helping the entire conversation of eco-socialism move beyond mainstream political parties. I think one of the sort of strangest things that I encountered in Extinction Rebellion, because I have also done some volunteering with Extinction Rebellion, one of the strangest things that I've encountered is like, we all have the same kind of ideas of where we want to see things going, very distinctly socialist bent, very environmentalist bent. We don't have a lot of policy disagreements at all. And then when it comes to discussing political parties, it's like there's these rigid divides between people who vote Green and people who vote NDP. And that's not helpful for building solidarity. I think we just kind of need to, especially like when we're not in election periods, just ignore political party divisions and talk more about what policy actions we want to see. And then when the election season comes around, kind of decide which political party is demonstrating the most of those policy actions. So I'm not really sure how that conversation could come about, but I think just having that kind of like education, like having these kinds of educational things like that, and like showing that, look, we're all kind of on the same page here, regardless of which political category we feel like we fall into better. But we need to make sure that we stay on the same page if we actually want to get stuff accomplished, and we need to stay on the same page during election season as well. How can Canada be held responsible for its actions around the globe? Well, I think, yeah, that distinction between the Canadian people and Canadian corporations is very important. That said, the Canadian government does have a very huge role in facilitating and enabling these activities. I think one of the biggest things that we as Socialist Action and we as socialists in general can do is help educate people about what the footprint of that role actually is. So I volunteer with a group called Voice of Ituri, and the goal of that group is to kind of highlight the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in the Democratic Republic of Congo that is driven a lot by mining of precious minerals like cobalt. And a lot of that mining is being done by Canadian mining corporations, and people in Canada don't know that. And a lot of the times I'll get into conversations that, well, why are you focusing on something that's going on over in Africa when we have our own problems here that you should be focusing on? Pick your focus. And it's like those problems are going on over there, but they're being caused by our inaction here. And they're things that people who are being affected by them cannot directly impact, but that we here in Canada can. And we can by voting, we can by protesting, we can by fundraising. There's so much that we can do, and I think we're really doing a disservice to people around the world by kind of pawning that off and saying that's their problem. And for the last one about animal welfare, I did kind of miss that question, but I heard the answers, and I just kind of wanted to chime in that, when we're talking about, when we're talking about prioritizing animal welfare, we really do also need to consider what the reverse of that is. So if you're taking, you're cutting meat out completely and you're replacing it with vegan alternatives, what's the human cost of producing those vegan alternatives? I know a lot of foods that are consumed here cheaply are actually staple foods in other parts of the world that don't make as much of a profit when they're sold there as they do when they're sold here. And they're actually shipped all the way around the world as well. So the carbon footprint can be larger than it looks when you look at it, like in terms of gallons of water taken to produce X crop, quinoa particularly. So I think one of the best sorts of things that we can do as eco-socialists and as environmentalists is just cut down our meat intake, treat meat like it is a special occasion, but then be very mindful of what we're replacing it with, especially in terms of protein sources. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Kurt, do we have other questions that have popped up?
Yes, we have quite a few.
Okay.
I'm just gonna go over 5, and I think we have enough for a third round as well.
Okay. That's great.
So the first question is, by Barry Weiser, how would nationalization of big oil and gas help to fund and facilitate a rapid transition to sustainable green energy generation? There's the follow-up question by Basil Fowell. Can you please comment on milk drainage that we saw happening and overabundant milk?
Okay.
Another question by Barry Weisletter. Big Farms Make Big Flu by Rob Wallace documents how capitalist intensive and extensive agriculture is what's behind COVID-19 and recent pandemics. Do you wish to comment?
Okay.
Let's see, what's the next one? There's for all interested in eco-socialism, I know SAC are NDP reformer, but people should watch my interview with Dmitry Leskarish, an eco-socialist running for the leader of the Green Party, says Yuri Muckraker. And yeah.
Okay, should we leave it with those ones, or is there another one?
No, that should be all.
Okay, so that last one seemed like it was more of a comment, so that's something we can all look into later. So I'll address the first 3 questions then. The question from Barry, how would nationalization of oil and gas help facilitate this transition? The answer is that once you nationalize and bring it into government control, and then by some extension, people control, the purpose of that industry no longer is to generate as much profit as possible, it's to help people. So in the meantime, you can still use that to fuel and create energy, but you would immediately be using that profit, and it's a profitable industry, and that very talented workforce to start building up your green sector. So to build up a green sector parallel to an existing for-profit oil sector will not work. They will not let that happen. That is their so-called livelihood. That's their profit. They're not going to let you compete even though you're the government. So you need to take that first, strip the power that comes with owning that capital from them, and then you have an opportunity to dismantle it thoroughly, but in a way that makes sense. So you don't have to turn it off overnight, but you can do it in a way that is going to make sure that our energy needs can be met and we can transition cleanly, and the workforce itself still has a job. It might not be an oil refinery job, but they'll be able to have some sort of job through a retraining program, etc. So you can really put the human needs first, the need for clean energy, the need for jobs, the need for a say in how we're running things. So that would be very important, because if you don't nationalize it, they've continuously undermined public rhetoric by spreading disinformation, by funding think tanks. They have outsourced, and they go to other countries where there aren't as many regulations. They wreak havoc there. So the emissions are global. It doesn't matter if the emissions are in Canada or elsewhere, it's global. So all those things need to be cut off at the source. There's a question about milk overabundance, I believe. I'm not as familiar with that, but if I understand it correctly, it's a situation where too much milk was produced and it wasn't all consumed. And that's something that you see with capitalism. It's one of the few economic systems where you can have a crisis of overproduction and people all of a sudden aren't able to buy it. And really, milk in Canada is quite propped up. It has a lot of subsidies, just like oil and gas. And although that could be good for small farmers to keep them economically viable, you have to look at the long-term consequences of a very intensive agricultural process. And again, when you have an overabundance, it's one of the contradictions in capitalism. In no other economic system is an overabundance of a resource a bad thing. You just stop making it when you don't need it anymore. But in capitalism, you just make so much until the whole system collapses, basically. That's why you have all these spikes. You keep making so many things, but you keep exploiting the workers till they can't afford what they're producing anymore. That's how capitalism is going to ultimately end, unless it ends us. And then the last question about big farms make big flu. This is something I've been very interested in. You can definitely make the case for COVID, but I'm just going to actually go entirely sidestep it and go to another huge issue that wasn't brought up today of antimicrobial resistance in bacteria. This is something that you see around the world. All farms around the world are basically using industrial amounts of antibiotics, not for animal welfare reasons, not to treat any sort of illness, but because it's thought to increase the growth rate of animals so you can get more profit because they're larger. So it's a purely capitalist motive. But then when you're adding so much antibiotics to the feed, you're selecting for antibiotic resistance, and those bacteria then kill humans. And by 2050, it's now being predicted that antibiotic resistance, if not checked, will kill as many people as cancer. And kind of similar to climate change, as we've known this is a problem for a long time, and it keeps creeping up, and we're just not doing anything about it because it's not profitable. And so many people would love to work in this realm, but one of the points that we've made, research right now is subjugated to corporate interests, to profit interests, and right now it's not profitable to make a new antibiotic. And it's not profitable to stop using industrial levels of antibiotics in the feed because animals grow bigger. So absolutely, farms need to be made democratic. They need to be put to human needs. So make the food that you need to feed your people, and do it in a way that's sustainable. I'll pass it on now to Tina.
Yeah, in regards to, obviously, there are many countries, not just Canada, but obviously Alberta and Canada rely upon our oil industry quite a bit. And so, when we look at the different resources, the different of being able to green, going to more of a green economy, it's just going to be a slow transition because of the fact that, people are used to the way that we live from day to day. We are used to living on what we rely upon in regards to that have the resources coming from those oil and gas companies. And so to be able to go through it overnight is a shock to people's systems, right across our country. And so it does have to traditionally, be a slow process to be able to respect everybody's learning capabilities. They're experiencing different experiences from the impacts of that being done, and as well the impacts on the environment of going through, of changing the processes that we live by now. Obviously, in regards to when we start investing in more greening and transitional resources, It's not only good for the Canada as a whole to be able to make that transition in its resources to better resources, but as well, it's going to have better impacts, in regards to when you look at the jobs for the people that are there, and the impacts even on them health-wise, in regards to, there are huge impacts in regards to probably the healthcare costs that they go through of being able to work in the oil and gas industries. And so when you stop, taking from and you're starting to put back and you're starting to green that area, it's going to take a number of years, could be even past the time that I even live. But I know that that's the way that we have to go to. And commenting in regards to, it's not only happening in Canada as well, obviously, they're doing the same processes in regards to different industries within international companies, and the same impacts, the same influences and effects are happening to those people in those lands as well. And so when we start going back to the basics of taking care of our environment, being able to be implicitly included in taking actions to go to a different place that we haven't lived with in an environment. Obviously, our current situation of COVID, many people are saying we cannot stay in the same climate that we lived with prior to COVID-19. Things have to change because of the fact that we are now being showing the exhibits of the imbalances that have occurred well before then because of capitalism. And in regards to the question on the milk, obviously, the changing of our farming has changed into industrial farming, and that has had a huge impact. And so when you look at the overages, again, people have to just, as you had said, in regards to, they have to just take what they need, not overtake on a daily basis. In regards to when we looked at people going to grocery stores, and they talked about the hoarding of the toilet paper. That's just a significant example in regards to where, when you don't need something to live on, you live from day to day, as opposed to living in fear. And that's what that fear mongering has been caused by capitalism. And so I guess in regards to, I completely lost the last question there.
It was about industrial agricultural and making of big pandemics.
Yes, and so my comment on that is that absolutely I understand that people are trying to find different solutions to world's problems, whether they're pandemics, whether they're the looking at different vaccines, or the mixing of chemicals with respect to being able to put onto our lands to make them grow bigger, the different sizes that you can clearly see when it's natural as opposed to something that's been injected with certain chemicals. There are a lot of experiments that are going along. People don't know what the exact impact is going to have over time. And so I think people do have to scale back in regards to doing the mixtures of trying to find something that is going to be a solution, but is not being healthy to our people. It's not being healthy to our lands. It's not being healthy to our animals. And it certainly is not being healthy to our resources like the land and the water.
Thank you so much for your insight, Tina. Yvonne? Yeah, so I just have a few quick comments. There's a really interesting article that I was reading when I was sort of like doing some preliminary research for what I said today. That's from the Tyee, and it's called, Government Revenue from Fossil Fuels in Sharp Decline. It references one study that's like, a couple hundred pages that found essentially that as the revenues from the fossil fuel industry rise, the government revenues have decreased sharply. So specifically, what they cite here is that the royalty revenue has plummeted from 63% since 2000. So in the last 20 years, we're now getting 63% less than we were, although the actual profits from the oil and gas industry have risen about 75% from the natural gas industry. From oil and gas combined, it's about 27%. So there's been drastic increases in the profitability of the industry and drastic declines in what the government actually takes away from that profitability. As well, back in, I think, 1979, we had about a 15% share from royalty revenue. So that's not tax revenue, but royalties. And now that's down to about 3%. So really, the Canadian government is consistently losing out. I think having the oil and gas industry hand over the keys and nationalizing that industry, we would be seeing all of those profits again, which I don't know how many people remember 1979. I know I don't. But I'm guessing it was not, or at least the 80s were not as plagued with economic, hyper-capitalism, where you have a very large section of the population who are incredibly badly, doing incredibly badly, economically speaking. And then you have a very, very small percentage who just have, more wealth than is even imaginable. And a lot of that is because you have these big industries like Amazon, like the oil and gas industry, like the telecommunications industry, that are essential and yet are not government owned and have no plans to be nationalized. And all of that money is going directly into private hands, and then it's being pooled in offshore tax havens so that they don't have to give any of it to the public. And all we get out of it is shitty jobs that don't pay rent, that don't pay for food, that don't have sick leave, even now. So I really think, obviously the public sector, we need a lot more employment in the public sector. The public sector is way more likely to be unionized. 75% of public sector employees are unionized, 15% and declining. Private sector is. So having a more robust public sector, having more industries, most industries in the public sector as a goal would generate a lot more revenue, would be a lot more feasible for scaling down our carbon emissions, because again, as you said, the profit motive, the motive will not be to generate maximum profits for a few people. It will be to benefit the country and the world and the people who are employed and the people who are, consuming the products. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on those ones. The second question about animal agriculture, I didn't have too much to say. I just, it did remind me of swine flu, which I think came out of extremely unsavory conditions in factory agriculture down in US and Mexico. And H1N1, I mean, I definitely remember that one. That was the first pandemic that I ever consciously lived through. I know I lived through SARS, but I was 7 or something, so I didn't care. But when I was 15, I was so definitely some lessons to be taken from that. And that sounds like an interesting book, Barry.
Awesome. Thank you, Yvonne. Kurt, are we going to take more questions, or are we going to wrap up?
We will wrap up, but we do have 2 more questions. So I would say that I ask the questions, and then we have our panelists, our guests, answer the questions and then say their final words, and then come back to you to answer the question and lead us out.
Sounds good.
Our first question is by Beatrix Kid Video. She actually made several comments, but since we have very little time, I'll just focus on what one of her statements that led into a question. And it's the one thing that capitalism has that socialism doesn't is the brainwashing of the public via media. How can socialism get more attention, make itself known to potential supporters? And the last question is, what are your thoughts regarding the eco-situation of people with precarious immigration?
Okay, let me just write those down. Okay, those are great questions. So I'm going to, again, try and keep it brief. Just we've been going at this for a little while. So that was a very astute observation. It's definitely the case where capitalism has the upper hand in terms of propaganda. Obviously, 99%, I don't know an exact percentage, of the major media that we see out there is for profit themselves. So they are a bit biased in their coverage of things. Any sort of reform that gets passed will also affect them. So we need a nationalization also of media. But until then, how do we try and compete with these massive organizations that have just saturated the radio waves and the television waves and the internet to that extent too. The internet's just a little bit, it's more subtle, but there's big corporate influence there as well. And really it needs to come from below. And especially an opportunity, well, I don't want to call it an opportunity, it sounds very insensitive, but right now the world's been turned upside down, and this needs to be a grassroots movement where we use this as an opportunity. Unlike capitalism, we shouldn't rely on just mere platitudes and just kind of statements. We need to actually build up that consciousness, and it's harder, but every person that you have that conversation with, every way you can disseminate that by selling a newspaper or whatever else. And if that person buys into the message, they get radicalized. That person's getting then hopefully radicalized a few more. We can have our own exponential curve on the other side. It's just we're at a disadvantage, but it needs to really be building up in that grassroots way, coming from below. And that way you can have a real united front there. In terms of the eco-socialist perspective on precarious laborers, this is obviously very important. In Ontario, we see a lot of precarious migrant workers coming up to pick fruit on farms and those types of things. And this is obviously very connected to a for-profit agricultural industry that has also a lot of environmental impacts. Bringing food production under the control of workers themselves, you'll again have decisions being made based on what's good for humans rather than what's good for just profit. And again, paying migrant workers below minimum wage and then not recognizing any of their other rights or benefits is very good for profit, but it's not good for humans. And just as a quick shout out, then there is a group, No One Is Illegal, and they advocated in the United Front at several environmental rallies I went to in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. And some of the speakers from No One Is Illegal were some of the most militant radical people I saw, where they were explicitly calling out capitalism. And I'll just leave it on this one great slogan that this person brought up. You can't buy a pipeline and be a climate leader. Progressive anti-racist Justin Trudeau is neither. And that was the first time I had heard that slogan, and that came from someone from No One Is Illegal. In terms of just my final remarks before I pass it on then, Marx noted something, and this was something that Tina mentioned, so I think it would be a great way to wrap it up. It connects some of the things that Marx saw with Indigenous knowledge, but they noted that what you're having in Ireland, even during the potato famines, you had crops being taken from Ireland, brought to England, and none of the nutrients of those potatoes and other crops were being returned back to Ireland. And so one thing that you mentioned, Tina, that I wrote down was taking the blood of Mother Earth and not replacing it. And that's what we see with capitalism. This is something that Marx even noted. You have resources going from the global south on the whole and for the most part, up to the global north on the whole and for the most part. And those resources are not being changed. And you're fundamentally altering the metabolism of that ecosystem. You're stripping of its resources, and it's for the basis of profit, and also the way everything has been expedited, the use of synthetic fertilizers and all these things. You're taking nutrients that are running off, and then it's going into a lake where it wasn't supposed to be. Now you have an algal bloom that's poisoning a poor community, and no one cares because they're poor, and there's no profit to be had in fixing that solution. So really, we could see this everywhere, but just fundamentally, where are the resources and the nutrients coming from, and where are they going? And when you ask yourself that question, you see that the reason this is happening is profit, the control that capital confers to a group of people, and they use that control to generate more profit, and the cycle just continues. So I'll now hand it on to Tina for answering those questions and any final remarks.
I guess in regards to, I like to look at things very simply. And we know that the governments and each successive governments have been feeding off in regards to the profits over many decades. And the more that they can extract, the more that they can put the profits into their pockets, does nothing to be able to support the sustainability of anything around us in terms of our resources. And in regards to when we look at the different resources, they are being so exploited in regards to the way that they're made, the way that they are not natural anymore. They look at the different ways of being able to produce them, and we look at the impacts of not only the ways and the methods, but in regards to, again, I have to really emphasize, we are making a lot of these things extinct around the profitability of our capitalists and our governments ongoing. If we actually looked at in terms of what our governments are doing, we know that they have think tanks, and what they're doing now was what they proposed in their think tanks 5 years ago. So they are well ahead of the game. And so when we look at the media in regards to the control over the media, they absolutely have put that into effect. They put that into their think tanks a number of years ago to shut down the open voices that they have. You have the people there that get fired for speaking their mind or writing their mind into the media anyways, or what they show, in regards to, it's all about profits in regards to what our members are viewing. And so to be able to fight the fight in regards to looking at the, social in regards to Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's in regards to the media, whether it's in terms of interviews, whether it's different shows, they are all making sure that we are learning how to learn their way, and brainwashing, as people have put it, in regards to the way that they want us to think. And we have to get out of that. We have to do a lot more questioning. We do have to do a lot more networking on Facebook or any other social media, so that we can talk to each other and to be able to clarify or to verify the actual facts. Because not usually when I'm watching TV are there actual facts being spewed from the commentators' mouths or our politicians specifically. It's lip service, or it's, maybe 60% of what the truth is, and the rest of it, they're all just making it up, and we've gotten so used to that. And the way that it's like the poll that was taken in regards to, around Donald Trump, in regards to 30% of the people think that, chocolate milk comes from chocolate cows. And so when you look at that particular poll, that's, a very good example of how people are enticed and brainwashed to think. But I guess just seriously, and putting it on a serious note, which obviously I've had throughout this whole forum, is that people have to change. People have to change the way that they're doing things. They have to change the way that they're thinking. In regards to, and the only way that you're going to be able to achieve that is by being able to work with other groups, to be able to understand what their fight is about, and finding the interconnections, finding how we can support one another, to be able to look at the different ways that we can take our different perspectives in mounting a united front, whether it's through labor movements, whether it's through the environment movements, whether it's through the socialist movements, in regards to what we are doing now. We have to change the way that we're doing things. And we have to look at in regards to analyzing the worldviews of people's reciprocity, and interconnectedness with nature, and being human beings and not robots. Need highlighting more sustainable Indigenous-led paradigms, and present concrete examples of where Indigenous worldviews, stewardship approaches, and on-the-ground guardians, to keep protecting the carbon-rich forests and from entrenched short-term economic interests. We need to make the case for more inclusive collaborations that engage Indigenous leaders as well. We need to design concrete actions that will help advance climate solutions in their sectors. And, we have to take part and take care of each other in all of our communities. Nobody can be left out. And we know what that model looks like as Indigenous people, of taking care of one another. So we have to start making those changes.
Thank you so much, Tina. Yvonne, your final comments?
So the question of how socialism can get people's attention, I think there's no easy answer. Well, there is an easy answer, but the actual achieving of that answer is very difficult, and that is getting the media on our side. That's how we're going to do it. Study after study, honestly, has shown that overall, the Canadian public is very favorable towards socialist policies. They just don't like calling it socialism, and they won't vote for anybody who does say that they're going to be doing something socialist, or who has a socialist reputation, even if they're not overtly socialist. We can educate people on the fact that these things are socialism, and that will cause them to reject it. because the media is giving such a negative view of socialism constantly all the time. And it's because so much of our mainstream media is owned by conservatives, people who have overwhelming economic interest in the status quo, maintaining the status quo. I personally, when I was running for office, I talked to a lot of journalists, just trying to like understand, like, why do you guys always print the same, like, I feel like I've read the same article about this election like 8 times from like 8 different sources. And it's because all of those sources are owned by the same people. And all of their editors are telling them that they want the same story because that's the story that is going to help reinforce that status quo. How do we get the media on our side? I do not have that answer. I think a lot of socialists are doing great jobs of making our own media. I know that there's a lot of great online broadcasts. There's a lot of great independent publications that have amazing content that still doesn't get read by the majority of the public because it's not controlled by extremely powerful economic interests. So I don't know what the solution there is. I think right now in COVID times, we do have an air of opportunity because all things are happening online right now. Nothing can happen out in the public sphere because we're not allowed to go outside. So people who traditionally read in print newspapers are not going to pick up their newspaper. Television, a lot of the news stations are broadcasting from home, and that is also kind of changing the nature of how things are delivered. It's putting kind of the mainstream news shows on par in terms of production quality with YouTubers, things like that, things like this. It's kind of weird seeing everybody dressed up in their home clothes, like broadcasting from their living room, when we're used to seeing them with a live studio audience. And I think it kind of humanizes what they're saying, again, puts it on par with what we're saying. Hopefully we can kind of leverage that. I don't know how, but I would really like to point out that there is an opportunity here. We should try our best to seize it and maybe put our heads together and figure out how, besides getting the media on our side, I really can't see a way for socialism to get a leg up because we are fighting such a titan in the mainstream media. So we really need to focus on that. That's all I have to say about that one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And thank you as well to Tina and for everybody that participated online asking questions, and also especially our wonderful producer, Kurt, who's in Mississauga. And I would like to just plug a few of our media. It was a good question to lead into it. If you're interested in subscribing to the best socialist monthly in North America, Socialist Action, you can just go to socialistactioncanada.ca. It's $25 for a 1-year subscription, which I think is a bargain. The coverage, again, for this month is obviously coronavirus, the American election. It's going to talk about the United Front, neoliberalism, things like that. And then also, for all the people that are part of the NDP, and if you ever see us at an event, we often sell copies of the Turn Left magazine. This is the official publication of the NDP Socialist Caucus, comes out once a year, and very apropos, our topic for last year's issue was capitalism versus life on Earth. You can also find a copy of our statement of principles as a political party online. And if you're interested in joining Socialist Action, again, you can visit the Socialist Action website, socialistaction.ca. You can get into contact with members of our group through there, or alternatively, you can call us at 647-986-1917. And with that, I would just like to thank everybody again for joining, participating, especially Tina and Yvonne. That was a really great conversation. If you're interested, just subscribe to this channel. Our next webcast is on Sunday, April 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic is an introduction to Marxist economics, the labor theory of value. And that's going to be featuring Yasin with discussants Corey and John. So those are some of the members of our group. Everybody, please stay healthy, stay safe, stay active. Bye for now. And remember, if we don't destroy capitalism, capitalism will destroy us. Cheers.